Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is the Bucky inspired comprehensivity for Bucky inspired comprehensivity for, give me just a second. Hold on. Okay, so can you get rid of William? Just a second, hold on. Okay. All right. Give me just a second. Yeah. All right. Let me make sure that I can do this. Okay, this is good. All right. So let me start again. Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is the Bucky inspired comprehensivity to understand and change the world. And we are off to a great start. And I am delighted to have Peter Meisen talking about synergy today. He has been in the Bucky world for decades, and he was one of the people that CJ said, you have to have Peter on. And he has very graciously agreed to talk about a general topic to start with. You know, he's done a lot of work on specific things, but a general topic of synergy to start with. So the format is Peter is going to have a fairly brief presentation, somewhere between 10 to 30 minutes. And then I'm going to invite people who are first familiar with Bucky to add to thoughts on synergy, what you would like to share. Know that we are, many of us here, including me, are just getting started with Bucky. So even if some point you think is a point which is well known, it's well worth focusing on it, because getting the core ideas right, deeply enough, broadly enough, is crucial to proceeding. So please, would love to hear you guys talk about synergy, but let's start with Peter. Peter, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Shrikant, and thank you everybody for joining us this evening. I'm in San Diego, wherever you're from. I'm not sure, but I'm sure across the U.S., so different time zones. But I'm always thrilled to get on these Zoom calls and talk about Bucky with anybody who willing to listen. This evening, for sure, this is one of the most important generalized principles of universe that Bucky spoke about. And so it has just profound implications in all parts of our lives. Some of you probably know this already. Some of you will maybe capture that a little bit as I go through a short presentation. Bucky likes to really identify the universal generalized principles, usually that can be reduced into a mathematical equation, because they are universal. There are no exceptions, and synergy is one of those. It's a term that has become common in our vernacular today, and popularized by a few people I'll speak to. 20, 30 years ago, I think it was new on the scene, and there was a question about really what this thing was. But first, I want to acknowledge and thank Shrikant. When I started, I guess, during COVID to hear about this thing and get invited to the 52 Living Ideas, I went, my gosh, there's this guy that's having a meetup almost every night, and on issues and thinkers that were universal to all of us. And so, I mean, what an amazing commitment, Shrikant, that you have had to, I think, sharing your time and so many great ideas of the philosophers and writers of our time. I do want to acknowledge CJ. Some of you knew CJ personally. He passed away about just a month ago, untimely, and was a good friend of some of ours and a passionate speaker about comprehensivity, which I think is really the theme of this whole series. So if you get to go to CJ's website, there's a lot that's still there. CJ Fearnley, Fearnley, CJ Fearnley. So please do that. Really a deep thinker on Bucky's work. And And what I want to do is certainly welcome some personal friends that I have on the call and invite them to share their thoughts. I am no deep expert on this topic. I've certainly lived it and shared it with some people, so maybe I can do some good work there. What I'd love for you to do is, as we get started, to think about the question, if whether you know it or not yet, how has synergy changed your life personally, in your relationships, in your business, in your work? That really is the discussion this evening, and whether you know it or not, it affects you every single day in so many ways. So that's really the question of the evening. I'm going to share a screen here now. Okay, somebody give me a thumbs up. Make sure we can see that.
Yes, it works.
Okay. Let's see if we can go from, are we on just the current slide? From the current slide, there we go. Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay, good. So in its most basic definition, synergy is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So I think we've all sort of heard that before, that there is no independence really in the world today. Everything is related to something else. So really, if I were to sum up this whole discussion this evening, that we are all related, we're all interconnected, and that's one of the key ways that it's done. So going down, where's my down button?
You will just need to click on the slide and then you can hit the down button.
There we go. Okay. I'm going to start with just a dictionary definition from Miriam Webster. It's about combined action or operation. It's a mutually advantageous conjunction or compatibility of distinct business applications or elements. So I'll speak a little bit about the business portion of this. The interaction or cooperation of two or more organizations, substances, talking about chemistry, maybe in this example, or other agents to produce combined effects greater than the sum of their specific effects. So it's always good to go back to what Funk and Wagnalls or Miriam Webster would say that this is. So let's just talk about the most basic equation that Bucky would speak to, that 1 + 1 is not 2, 1 + 1 is greater than or equal to 3. The demonstration that I really liked with this, some of you maybe saw the Buckminster Fuller play, the Buckminster Fuller, The History and Mystery of the Universe, and D.W. Jacobs, who wrote that play, is going to be speaking in a few weeks, included this in the play, and I loved how it really showed that this is a truism in our world. We're all familiar with the triangle. So Bucky spoke about fundamental structure in universe is the triangle, three-sided, three-pointed, not structure, but just a triangle, but it doesn't have any particular volume. And if you took off one of the connections, he started saying that, well, this can now be considered an energy event. And if you do it with another triangle, it's another energy event. And he talks about how energy events are oftentimes, whether they're people or they're molecules, they're floating around in universe and they come together. And when they come together, they can form this tetrahedron, which now has 4 sides, 4 points, instead of a one-sided triangle, and two triangles with one sides now become a 4-sided tetrahedron, which does have volume. And obviously, just as a simple example here, you get way more than just 2 things when you add 1 and 1 together. So he used that oftentimes in his discussion, and you'll see it as we go through. Many synonyms for synergy. We have this word graphic here that is used around it. There are alliance and coaction and union and unity and team effort. So all of them have some relationship to this same word. Gosh, in business, it's talked about all the time about team effort and coming together. Not as often in the chemical world, but you'll see that that's a fundamental aspect of many of our scientific disciplines. So Synergy has created many good stepchildren, and these are just a few of those. Here's a graphic that you might see in any business meeting, where it says if we get together and we have partners, good ideas, we cooperate, the benefits are increased, and this magical thing called synergy is created. So this is often what will come out at the end of a good strategic planning session, is what you're trying to have is this cooperative team that now is working and rowing together and can have results far beyond just the members that are sitting around the table. And so this is a sort of a nice graphic that you'll see in many a business meeting that explains what we're speaking to. And probably the guru around this in the business sense is Stephen Covey. It was his habit number 6. I liked it. He basically said, synergy means 2 heads are better than 1. You get 2 people together and talk and have a glass of wine, have a beer, have a cup of coffee, and you start talking, you come up with something way better than just the one individual by itself. So it's a habit of creative cooperation, teamwork, an adventure of finding new solutions. And he says, synergy is better than my way or your way, it's our way. So anytime you have a small group of people working toward a common activity, you can call that a synergistic application. And Stephen obviously encourages that in any business activity to get extraordinary results. Chemistry is one great example of synergy that lives on all the time in our lives. Most people are familiar with the periodic table. Those are individual elements, but they don't have inner synergy as individual elements. But you take a couple examples here. 2 particular elements that are toxic by themselves. I put chlorine in my pool to clean it. So it is a safe place to swim in, and bacteria don't grow. Sodium by itself is a toxic element, but you put them together and you have table salt. And so who would know unless it's created naturally in the environment. We can do it in the lab. But it's used extensively around the world, and it's the combination of 2 toxic things on the periodic table. And then everybody knows H2O. So how can you take 2 gases? You really think about it, that hydrogen is one of our most lightweight gases. Oxygen right there again on the periodic table, but you put them together in H2O, and you have this amazing thing called water, which allows us to live. It's in our bodies. I think 80% of our bodies are water. 70% of the earth is water in terms of the top of the planet. So it is chemistry surrounding us, and it is synergy in action. And in the field science, field sciences, these 2 equations sort of woke me up to I think the beauty of our world, to have these 2 equations look so similar. A gravitational force, the one on the bottom, most of us are very familiar with, whether it be the apple falling out of the tree. The small apple is the M1, the big M2 is our planet. So that's the force, gravitational force, which is then inversely proportional to the diameter, the distance between the 2 radii. So gravitational force of an apple to the earth is very strong. Same thing with electrical force. Look at that equation and you'll go, there's something universal here that when I first saw it, I said something almost mystical is going on between these 2 sciences, where you have the electromagnetic force a function of K being Coulomb's law. You have the two forces Q1 and Q2, the product of those two divided by the radius between the two, radius squared between the two electromagnetic forces, and you get the two forces, and you get the electromagnetic force of that particular relationship. And so how did that turn out? I mean, we explored it. We looked at those two, and we said there's something unique going on here in the world. And I kind of woke up to our sort of what Bucky called the history and the mystery of the universe when I started exploring these common equations that show up in seemingly different fields. So what Bucky said, and this was this came out from his son-in-law, I want to say Robert Snyder, is that right? His son-in-law was a filmmaker, did the film The World of Buckminster Fuller. He had Bucky on Bear Island in Maine, where he took his summers. And Bucky was talking about all of the bubbles that were in the seashore, and there's trillions of bubbles. And to make a perfect bubble, we use the pi, this number that is not able to be ultimately determined. It's 3.14 and then goes on forever. He said nature isn't making any imperfect bubbles. Nature isn't using pi. He picked up a piece of wood and said, I could never lift that stone, but if I put this piece of wood over that piece of wood, I could lift this stone. Leverage is another generalized principle that certainly could be explored in a future session. And then he looked up the moon, and he said, how does this moon go around the Earth with no strain, with no clear attachment? And obviously it's that equation of gravity. And looking further, he basically said synergy, that's an example of synergy of the moon going around the Earth. And he says synergy holds the whole universe together. And with that, again, I just went, oh my gosh, this is a profound generalized principle that's always going in our lives all the time. And so this is just a picture of Bucky with one of his icosahedric models that has none of those rods are touching any of them. There's just rods and tension components. So you have this equilibrium between tension and compression, and again another sort of a synergistic model that Bucky created. So that's it, Shrikant. That was my introduction to this conversation around synergy. I'd ask the question, how does synergy show up in your life, to all of our guests tonight? And I was certainly thinking about that for me, since I was going to pose it. I guess one of my good examples was taking a stand for something that was way beyond my individual capacity. 30 years ago, I said, if this is important, this needs to be done. If nobody else is doing it, I had enough education and understanding to take on a project. And I said, okay, this is something we need to do, and it became my life's work. And by taking that stand, by speaking it to friends, first of all, just my friends, because I didn't know if I was really didn't know if I was a little crazy or not. I wasn't quite sure about the technology, but they all said, well, it's a good idea. Probably won't happen because you have to get all the countries together to make it work, but good luck. And then after, I would take you on a whole series of what happened, but cover stories in magazines, meeting world leaders, conferences around the world, thousands of people saying this is a good idea. An example of if you take on something that's bigger than yourself and speak it to the right people, many will show up around you to help make it happen, because there's no way it can happen by yourself. And that was the Genie Initiative, and we'll probably talk about that at another time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Peter, could you stop sharing? Oh, wonderful. Thank you. All right, folks, let's see. Now, people who are familiar with the concept of synergy, who are familiar with, Bucky's thought on this, I'm going to first invite those people. Peter, are there any, I know Kurt knows. Do you see anybody else whom?
Kurt would have some thoughts and probably some good examples. I know that.
Wonderful. Let's start with Kurt. Kurt, what do you think?
Well, thanks, Peter, for giving us that really nice introduction and all those great examples. We hear a lot nowadays about the word emergence. And I wonder, Peter, if you've thought about how emergence and synergy are related.
Wonderful. Kurt, would you like to spend some time talking about your thoughts on synergy after Peter, answers the question?
Sure. Well,
okay.
A little bit.
Okay. Yeah. Peter, go ahead.
Sure. I remember, and it was either in one of Bucky's books or when he spoke. He talked about emergence was just a subset, or emergence was a subset of the word emergency, that we do emerge from emergency, that most, at least in my life, it's fairly comfortable. I've been very fortunate, and it's easy to get lazy, if you will, in living in the quality of life that we do in America. We have shelter, we have TVs and phones and refrigerators, things that 1 billion people around the world, actually 2 billion in some cases, don't have at all. They have no running water, they don't have a toilet, they're living in daily emergency. So what happened, he said, was we need to be broken out of our comfort sometimes by emergencies. And so I'm going to say a good example right now is the war in Ukraine. It is an emergency. It's certainly a critical emergency for the people that live there. It's become an emergency for those that were dependent on the grain supplies for in many places, especially in Africa and the Middle East, that they supplied. It's caused an emergency in Western Europe around fuel supplies for this winter. And so what occurred out of this emergency, and I hate to think of that we always have to go through a war, I don't think we do. Clearly the climate issue is an emergency, and we're emerging with solutions out of that. One of the, if there's any benefit to this war whatsoever, is that renewables now are the dominant new energy resource in Europe, that more wind, more solar is being developed faster than any other energy resource, because we can no longer count on fossil fuels to keep the lights on and to keep us warm. And people don't bomb. I hate that they're bombing critical infrastructure. It pains me. But people do not bomb wind farms. They do not bomb solar farms. They're just not strategic in the same way as a power plant is. So one and again, I don't want to say good thing. One thing that's come out of this that's been of benefit is that really strong commitment to renewables in Western Europe, and actually in America. There's more wind and solar being built today than coal in the United States, and so it has overtaken the formal dominant energy resource, which always has been coal. Coal has declined. Solar and wind have accelerated dramatically. So has natural gas to pick up some of the slack from coal being reduced. But we have a new energy resource that's being driven faster by an emergency of a war, as well as the emergency of climate change.
Thank you.
We're seeing that on the West Coast dramatically right now with our river after river of rains, and all the climate scientists are saying this is the new normal. On the East Coast, you get it with huge ice storms and tornadoes. Ours looks like either too much rain, or the last 10 years have been a long extended drought. So that emergence through the emergency is to accelerate our uptake of renewables. My wife says we need to get off the path of pollution and on the road to renewables. So it's
Thank
a
you.
nice little statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Kurt, go ahead. What do you think of synergy? How do you think about synergy?
Well, Peter, thank you. That was great. And that really was helpful for me, because I nowadays, I'm often with people who are studying systems, and they've been using this word emergence a lot. They're using the word synergy less, and I think they're pretty closely related. And so I was curious what you thought, and your examples I thought were excellent, because they showed sort of new levels of systems behavior happening, right? When Bucky said emergence through emergency, what he meant was, or at least what I think he meant was, we learn to do things differently. We do things better. We combine parts, right, in probably unexpected ways. And I think every example, excuse me, that you gave, Peter, showed that new level coming up, which, like I said, it's often called emergence or emergent levels, but I do believe it's just another way of looking at synergy. So
And I think he was always speaking about better design. That's a lot. I think what we're going to be speaking about in this series is the whole, the big discipline, if you will, is something called comprehensive anticipatory design science. I don't think we want to get into the whole depth of what that means, but using better design so that the old way of doing things becomes obsolete. Bucky whips are obsolete now because we have better automobiles. Fossil fuel automobiles are going to become obsolete in California. You won't be able to buy a new one by 2035. The combustion cars will still be on the road for another 10, 15 years, but there will be no new combustion cars in California 2035. And I think many times other states follow what we do. So it's a better design. And that's the idea. Can you use less materials, less energy, less materials, less energy, less time to get the same output that we really want. And what we really want in our transportation sector is to get from here to there in a safe and secure way. And if we can do that with a better design, in this case, an electric car, or maybe an electric bike or an electric scooter or a subway, that's better than everybody getting in a gas-powered car.
Yeah. And then it has these unexpected results as well, right? Like all of a sudden the cities are quieter, and all of a sudden the pollution associated with producing the fossil fuel and all that gets improved. So I think those are other examples of synergy happening, right? With a better design. It just makes, other aspects of the system improve, I guess. So I really like
comprehensive design will always look at the whole life cycle of any design activity, right? So it isn't just producing electricity. It's where did we dig the coal? Well, the coal went into a train. The train had to dump it off at a power plant and do that same process again and again and again. And when I was traveling around Wyoming, my gosh, it was the windiest state I've ever been in. And they are now building windmills, and it's just unpopulated as a state in the center. So here's this fossil fuel dominated state on our country that's digging coal and burning it and sending those electrons via transmission lines around the West, which could be doing the exact same things with wind farms, which again is a better design with getting us the same thing that we want. We want the lights to go on. We want the refrigerator to keep the beer cold. We want the TV to work, right? And if you can do that with wind farms and solar on your rooftop, that's better than big coal trains coming out of coal mining country.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So to go back to another of your examples, Jon, if you'll bear with me for a second.
Please.
So the water one, I often hear that discussed as well. And you gave a great example of these two chemical elements that when they put together, you form a molecule of water. Well, that's cool, but what happens if you have a bunch of molecules of water? Well, they start to flow. Well, who would have thought that from looking at, sodium and chlorine or chloride? And then what happens when it gets cold? Well, those molecules lock together in a certain way, don't they? And guess what? That winds up to be what they call less dense, right? The frozen molecules of water are spaced apart farther than if they were liquid. And so therefore it's less dense, which means the ice forms in the top of the ponds. And many people have said if that wasn't that way, we wouldn't be here, right? Because basically ponds would have frozen through, and then, with the weather we had, life would not have survived. And then look at snowflakes. Who would predict snowflakes by looking at either water or sodium or chloride? So another example of synergy. And then you get into flow of water. And when you start, just pour a little water. It's a very smooth flow. They call that laminar. But then if you ever looked at a river where it's running really fast, all of a sudden you see those swirling eddies and things like that. That's turbulent flow. And once again, you wouldn't have been able to predict that. So there's like 7 levels of synergy or emergence in water. So it's a great example because we all have this experience with it. And I think what was really powerful about your presentation, Peter, was just to emphasize that this happens when people get together, right? That when 2 people get together, it's not just the sum of these 2 people, but a third thing is created, which is bigger than both of them.
Wonderful, beautifully put. Thank you, Kurt. And water is very big. I like Bruce Lee's term, "Be like water." It's a Taoist term. But what it is saying is something very deep. It's saying, see how nature flows, and flow with it. Because if you do that, then the effects that you achieve, it's the Wu Wei. It's with very small amount of energy expended, you are far more effective because you're moving with everything, with nature, instead of trying to go against nature. You're trying to go with nature. Beautifully put. Thank you. Next up is Becky. So folks, I would love to hear what you guys think about, what does synergy mean to you? Let's start. I want to just read out Bucky's definition again, and we will go ahead. Just want to have everybody talk about what they understand by synergy, and we will continue with that. So there are two definitions here. One, synergy means behavior of whole system unpredicted by the behavior of their parts taken separately. Okay, so behavior of the whole system unpredicted by the behavior of their parts taken separately. Second one, synergy means behavior of the integral, aggregate, whole systems unpredicted by the behaviors of any of their components or subassemblies of their components taken separately from the whole. Okay, let's go with Becky next. Folks, if you want to comment on synergy, what does synergy mean to you? Okay, what we're trying to do is that we are in the process of learning. So let's just talk it out. What does synergy mean to you? Becky.
Okay, so I have a very good example. At least this is what pops in my head when I think about synergy and what happens when you try to work from the units rather than from the whole. And it would be similar to like the greedy algorithm, where we look at all the units that we have, all the parts that, let's say, are in our play box, and we assess, okay, well, this one is individually the best. And so we've anchored this one unit as the first. And then we introduce, well, out of what's left, which one do we think is the best? And so now we've put something down. And then, but now with the second, it interacts with the first. And we don't go back and reconsider the first. Now we look at what's left. Okay, now what happens when we bring in the next? And every time we bring in something else, well, the interaction may change in that the first that was laid down may not be the ideal choice anymore. And it might be that something else emerges. And so, but this path that we've gone down, it has been in a linear way. And so the answer or that we get at the end might give us like a short-sighted view of a solution or design. But if we don't consider every single thing that we put into the system and all the interactions of not just the new thing, but all combinations, then we don't really know how to, if we have the actual optimal answer. And so that's one of the issues of building from the units, and it takes a lot of effort to really understand what ends up being the whole. We would have to take all combinations of interactions in order to do that. So that's what I think of with that definition of synergy. Like it's unpredictable when you look at just the individual parts.
Wonderful. Thank you, Becky. Anybody else wants to talk about how they understand synergy, or is welcome to do that? I have a couple of observations, but I want everybody else to have a chance to speak about their understanding of synergy. We're going to go.
Let me suggest this. I think one of the most powerful things or examples of that is in the relationship we have with our spouse. Don't know how many people might be in relationship here in this meeting this evening, but if you think about who you were before the relationship, and I hopefully it's a good relationship, and who you are now as a couple afterwards, and what you were able to do and create, and I think maybe new friends together. That's often a great example. Clearly that's true for me and my wife, but I'm sure that may be true for others. So it's oftentimes in a business relationship or a personal relationship.
Excellent point. Thank you, Peter. Next up is going to be Joe, Penny, and Paul. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I understand synergy. It kind of applies to everything. And Peter just actually did a very good job of applying it to even our everyday relationships. And that's the beauty of actually understanding synergetics, is that you kind of have insights into every aspect of life. One of the areas that I think that it is kind of, synergetics has kind of shown me a little bit, or given me some insights, is in organizational dynamics and understanding the dimensions of an organization. And then understanding the particulars that actually help the particular parts that actually run the organization. So many times people will only think from their one perspective when they're doing their job, and that will be their ultimate goal, but they will fail to see the whole and how the parts actually, how their jobs and their individual tasks fits into the greater to the whole organization itself. And those are particulars or degrees of freedom, you could even call them. Bucky talks about 12 degrees of freedom. And so in understanding that and understanding the dimensions of an organization and understanding how those things work together, I think that that's where you can come up with, you can see where Bucky's principles also work in, and also where the interactions of the particular parts of an organization and how they all work together or don't work together in many cases. And when they don't work together, you can see where inefficiencies start to occur. So I think that that's one small area where you can then extract that example and apply it across, entire, ecosystems or the universe. So that's the interesting part about Bucky, is that he can kind of apply his concepts to everything. But I found it very useful with organizational dynamics.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Penny, Paul, and Ella. Penny.
Okay. Well, one of the things I was going to mention was the family, but Peter already said that. And another thing, and this has been since I've been a child, and I think this is synergy, like cooking. Like you take a couple ingredients and you put them in a pot and they don't even look appetizing, and you stick it in the oven and then you pull it out and you've got this beautiful dish and it's aromatic and the flavors are different than anything else. And I've always thought that was almost like magical, but I think that's like synergy, that you take these individual units and you would not predict this great, dish you're going to get. And that's something that, like I do every day because I cook every day, but I mean, it's kind of a simple example, but to me, that's synergy.
Wonderful.
Perfect example, Penny. Come on, that's again the individual parts. You would go, what are these together? And you fire them up a little bit, and you have this terrific meal or a roast or whatever you're making. And it's again chemistry in our kitchen.
Right.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I just want to add to the cooking metaphor here. India is very rich in spices. And there is a restaurant here that I like very much. And what they do is that they firstly, instead of using just 5 spices as other Indian restaurants do, they would use a larger number. So maybe 8 spices. And then they do something very interesting. Instead of grinding it, into a powder, they grind it coarsely. So what happens is that each morsel you eat is slightly different. And what it does is that really brings out the flavor, because you don't know what the next one is going to, it's going to be in the same symphony, but it's going to be a different variation. And that's going to add something to your taste and your experience of that. So that's wonderful. Thank you. Next up is going to be Paul, Jeff, and Katie. Paul.
Thank you, Srikant. And thanks for the presentation. It was great. The definition, one thing that sort of nags at me a bit about the definition that includes the word predicted, doesn't feel like it's getting at the essence of it. Because I could, if I know enough about chemistry, pretty much predict what will happen when I combine sodium and chlorine. But I think it's more the essence of synergy for me is that there's a new property that wasn't in any way present in either of the 2 sources. And I didn't quite hear that the way I wanted to in the definition. Another example of that would be, since we're adding examples, and tell me if you agree with Srikant, because we talk all this geometry. So if you have a triangle in a 2-dimensional space, and you add a third point not in the plane, boom, you have something called 3D space. Now that's synergy, and it's a property that isn't in the point above or the triangle below. So there's my thoughts. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful example. And we will talk about this point about predictability. So what, the issue of prediction, predictability. So that's something we will get to. So I'm making notes of points that come up. So that's one of the questions that we will deal with. Okay. But I want to get all the voices on the table first, and then we will go from there. So it's going to be, let's see, give me just a second. It's going to be Ella followed by Jeff and Katie. Ella.
Hi, yes, I enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much. I keyed in on the looking at the entire life cycle. I thought that was very interesting because I think it's very important. And I think a couple of other people also noted that it's difficult to predict what's going to happen by looking at the end result, even though the end result may be a positive intention. The parts need to be considered, the main components. And so I was thinking of a situation as a response to the green energy, non-renewable energy, and and alternative forms, and how, of course, that's a wonderful idea, but and a great end, sort of a utilitarian idea of a wonderful end for everybody, for the world, for the country. However, there are people that are affected by it in a very negative way. Factory workers are losing their jobs. And I think if you're looking at the comprehensive design, that hopefully they are focusing in on the lifestyle of people who no longer have employment due to, well, actually the factory workers, it's AI. But with the coal workers, the energy workers, they're in very deep poverty. And you don't have to look, in a foreign country. It's right here in Appalachia, in America. So I think you have to look at all the subparts, the moving parts, take a look at the entire thing and address what do they do now? How are they going to be retrained?
Wonderful. What we'll do is we'll take all the questions at the end, because what I want to do is I want to put all the thoughts down of everybody. So I want to have everybody have a say first, and then we will deal with these questions. So I'm making notes of all the questions. I will also ask people what other questions they would like to discuss, and we will discuss all the questions. But I want to have the first round, what everybody, with everybody putting their thoughts about synergy on the table. Next up is going to be Jeff, Katie, and Judy. Jeff.
Hi, Shrikant. Hi, everyone.
Welcome.
Those of you who know me, that I'm actually oriented towards starting with the questions. So, Peter, some of the questions that I would offer is that within synergy, what is the significance of the individual, independent, autonomous, separate entities? What's the significance of hydrogen and oxygen alone? So, and I have major reason for this. And then second, what is the significance, as Kurt was saying, of temperature, for example, as an example of context? What is the significance of context to synergy? Whether it's, hot or cold, or whether gravity exists, or, you could look at a lot of different contexts. And even I would offer nuance to things rather than simple combinations, but kind of certain things in relationship with each other. For example, two atoms of one and one of the other. And those are just examples. They're almost just metaphors for what I think is, going to Paul's point, quite often in human endeavors, when a situation that we're faced with, as in a context, requires us to come up, it's complex. It's not just complicated. It's, where there's 1,000 pieces to the puzzle and we can put the puzzle together. It's complex. We've never had that situation before, and we don't really know exactly what to do with it. Nothing has ever been done to it with it that's proven yet. And so what we're going to have are hypotheses, and we may decide to test multiple hypotheses at the same time just to figure out how to make a little progress here with regard to addressing the complexity of a situation. And then to Kurt's point, what if the situation is changing? It's not static. So to me, the nature of the individual things, their context and nuance actually are as significant as their interaction, which then is the synergy. So to just focus only on the interaction, only on the synergy, I think is inadequate. There's a lot more to this concept than only the interaction itself. And that's
Wonderful.
what I'd offer.
Jeff, I'm going to put these as questions and we will deal with all the questions together. So what is the significance of individual things? What is the significance of
context?
How do you deal with things which are complex and changing in this? Beautiful, beautiful questions. Folks, think of questions, okay? Think of questions. And we will deal with all of them at, or once everybody has had their say, including me, we will go ahead and deal with all the questions, all right? Next up is going to be Katie, followed by Judy. Katie.
Yeah, I liked the idea of one because it makes it sound like one is already a whole on its own. A part could be a whole if you wanted it to be a whole. And I liked it in the context of a company because I think one of the best ways to know whether the company is headed off in the wrong direction is just feedback from other people. And then I liked what Becky was saying, that this kind of experimentation, I think Jeff was saying that too, experimentation. So then sometimes like two things won't work together. The opposite of synergy is antagonism. I need water, I need electricity, but the two together can electrocute me. So sometimes things don't work together well. And you might not be able to predict that going in.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Katie. Excellent. Next up is going to be Judy, followed by Shrikant. And then anybody else who wants to comment in the first round, they're welcome to do that. Judy, go ahead.
Okay, I wanted to express my experience, my personal experience in Synergy. And it was in American Express when I worked there as a manager of training. The whole organization decided that they were going to go from hierarchical management to quality management. And they trained us all in quality management and continuous process improvements, systems approach to training, so that we could develop teams to make decisions and to change operations and develop new marketing tools, but with a team approach. And that was very difficult, I must say. The majority of people resented this type of change, because no longer there was a leader, there was a team making decisions. And a lot of the jobs got redesigned because we found a lot of repetition in different same people, a lot of people doing the same job and all kinds of other things. And it was quite an experience because of the reaction that people had. So my question is, even though it did work for us while we were implementing it, and we had the express desire of top management to make it happen, a lot of the people resented this big change. So my question is, how do you make this synergetic change in an organization last? How do you keep it going? How do to not develop this entropy, which is something that seems to be part of the synergetic process? I don't know if it's part of that or not. Maybe we have to go through different cycles. I don't know. So that was kind of like my question.
Wonderful. Brilliant question. Thank you. So I'm keeping track of all the questions as best as I can. And then I'm going to, once everybody has done speaking, then I'm going to ask people. I'm going to list all the questions I have, and I'm going to ask you if you want to add more questions. Then I'm going to organize all the questions from the general questions to more specific. We'll start with the general questions, and everybody will get to chime in on what they think about each of those questions, okay? Next up is going to be Becky, followed by Joe. Becky.
There was something that Joe had said that I thought was very good. Like when you work with the individual parts and you keep adding something into the systems, it's often hard to keep track of what's going on. But when you look at the whole, you can feel and you can see from a bird's eye view where the inefficiencies might come in from that individual adding, if you were to look at building up from a unit standpoint. And so that when you keep adding things, rather than looking at the whole, you might be introducing redundancies, or things just may longer not be useful. So I guess going back to what we had talked about this afternoon, this idea of the most effective minimum. It's like, well, a good design would be what you have without having excess, because you want to be efficient, but it has everything that you need in the system. It's economical. So that was just the thought I had from Joe.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, just one thing that I thought about synergetics sometimes is that, and it kind of emerges, and I often think of things in terms of maybe in a business context, but I think of a company like Amazon that was initially selling just books, and that gradually branched into an online marketplace that was then storing a lot of information, and now their biggest business is essentially going to be cloud computing. And so what they started to see is the interactions, like, okay, what can we do next? Where does our business make sense to go next? And they saw the connections between the information that they were gathering and their cloud computing business. And they went from selling books. And the only reason you're able to do that is you're able to understand the whole ecosystem that you're entering and what you do and why you're doing it. So that's, to me, is something is understanding like how synergetically a company can grow organically. The opposite of that would be a company that just goes out and tries to acquire other companies and grow just through sheer acquisitions, because then the synergies may not necessarily, the cultures may not work together well, the companies may not work together well. There's a lot of risk that goes along with it. So there's like this natural evolution that can come. And I think of that as a way of thinking about synergetics as well.
Wonderful. Peter, would you like to add an observation?
Sure. I really wanted to introduce somebody who's joined us, D.W. Jacobs.
Doug, welcome. Sorry, I did not notice.
And Doug is, if there's ever a master at synergy in what he's done in his life, Doug is a director, producer, writer of theater for decades. And he's the one that wrote the play, Buckminster Fuller, The History and Mystery of the Universe. But what I see happen around just words, I'll call it words on a page and a single actor, turns into a phenomenal orchestra of people and activity. Doug, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you could certainly speak about synergy in your own work in your life.
Absolutely. So Doug, whenever you're ready, just go ahead and type ! Would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you. So I'm going to make 2 points. Doug, go ahead.
Could you repeat the question? I had to leave the room for 30 seconds and then a question came to me as I came into the room.
Okay,
Doug, I was saying, if anybody knows really what synergy is in their life and their work, it's somebody who is involved in theater and as a writer, producer, director. What starts with a small group of maybe sometimes just one person and a word on a page becomes a symphony of people. You could certainly speak to synergy almost better than any of us.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of an ensemble of performers, or in the case of this solo show, the Bucky play, an ensemble of a performer and then the technicians and designers who sort of supported the performer, and where the technical effects were like waves coming out of the ship of the performer driving the action of the play. And so that theater is very much, when it works at its best, there is synergy. When it doesn't work, there's a series of collisions and roadblocks. And but I also, I'd forgotten tonight was Peter's night, because this is one I wanted to attend, and I just got freed of something and checked in, and so I came here because Peter really is kind of the uncle of the play itself. I mean, he invited me to work on the centennial, which I've talked about, which is where I actually first met CJ, but didn't realize it at the time and made a stronger connection to him later. CJ was there and a range of people were there. But he handed me a book, The Monologue Scenario by Robert Snyder, and said, this is what we might use for the event. And I had that book in my hands for about an hour or two when I realized, oh, this should be a play. This is a play that I might be uniquely designed to write, because I'd seen Bucky speak in 1968. So by Peter just coming into my office and demanding the use of the theater, which was booked, but then he drafted me to work on the event, is a perfect example of synergy. I mean, Peter's relentless and can be annoying, but it really becomes, he's a matchmaker, and a lot of interesting things happen around Peter. I mean, he just wouldn't let me say no to any of that. And I was happy to do it because it seemed to fulfill a need. And so while we were producing that event, I was talking about the play, and Javier Velasco, the artistic director of the San Diego Ballet, worked on that event as well. And we'd have meetings with him, and he'd go, yeah, the play should also be a musical, and it had to have a sailor and a chorus girl in the play, because those show up in the play, in the story of Bucky's life. I mean, he dated a very famous chorus girl from one of the big shows, Marilyn Miller. And it was, and she had a very good influence on his life, apparently. The family was really kind of grateful to Marilyn Miller for her influence on him. So they're really strange synergies that sort of, whenever you get around Bucky, there are weird synergies that start to happen. And even to the point where we scheduled the play, and Peter would come along to various productions in San Francisco and Boston and Washington, D.C. And we'd set up the book table and the toy table, and he'd hire people and train them or get volunteers to work this table. And, you know, it would create a kind of, for theater people, it was odd because it was like this market in the middle of the lobby at intermission, you know, but it also added to the kind of, oh, I get to play one of these toys that I just saw the actor play with. And so they would go to these tables and gravitate to them. And it was a sort of energy in the theater and in the building and in the lobby that was very unpredictable. And I had great designers, one from England who'd worked with progressive productions there, a composer from Mexico City who'd studied Bucky in Mexico City when he was in high school in 1968, when Mexico City was blowing up, much like the US was blowing up in 1968. And so there were all these really interesting people who kind of all had their own hit on where the production should go. And very strangely, it all blended and worked and complemented each other because they were kind of the right people. I was married at the time, and my wife actually wanted projections in the show. and she was the costume designer, and said, well, I'll donate my budget so we can do production of images, projections. And I can go to LA, the Karma district, and I'll find a suit for $150. And she did a good suit for $150 and donated, because Bucky wore very nice suits. So we wanted a really good suit. Some productions spend $1,000 or $1,500 on just the suit and the making of it and the tailoring of it. But that kind of thing, when you have the right team of people that really listen to each other, some pretty miraculous things happen. And Peter has a tendency of walking into a room. I don't know if he's talked about this, but this Zoom meeting reminds me of a room that Peter set up in San Diego. And we were even talking about maybe doing the play in this room, where he would have this many people in a room, each one with a computer, each one tied to a projector that would show the images on it. So it was a theatrical Zoom meeting. And you would be in there in the room with these people who'd all be doing their own research on a computer, and they'd slam what they found into a projector that would show it on screens that circled the room. So Peter, and one of my friends, Todd Blakesley in San Diego, helped him sort of develop some of the manifestations of that room. But really, it was Peter's idea for how to create a room that would build on the synergy of people's research. And this can't quite do it, a Zoom meeting where you're in a room and there are 20 projection screens reflecting the research of 20 people in the room as the discussion is going on. I mean, that's amazing theater. So I just I felt like I had to come here and give Peter a bow for everything he did for the production and for the world of Bucky. And so thank you.
Thank you, Doug. That was amazing. Thank you. So I want to say a couple of things. I want to point out a couple of things. So firstly, I want to say three things. So first one is about these meetups themselves at 52 Living Ideas. This is a great example of synergy. All of us come with different. Look at this meetup on synergy itself. All of us have some concept of synergy, and we are explicating it as best as we can. We are exploring different aspects of it, different limits of it. We're trying to define it, but it is being done in a synergistic way. It's not one person who is speaking, it's many people who are speaking, and each has a connection to synergy. Each has an experience about synergy. Each has questions about synergy. And we are actually trying to explore synergy synergetically. So this is a great example of synergy. One small example I want to give is that of improv, the idea of yes and. You are actually saying yes to the other person, trying to understand the other person, trying to see where they're coming from, a genuine connection with another human being, and then picking up what you can and then speaking back to them. Some of the great theater works like that, where you know everything that you have known, but when you come to encounter another human being or a set of human beings, you're not only offering the best you have, but you are actually listening to them and then speaking back to them from the depth of your own understanding. And what that produces is magical. It is magical. Go ahead, Doug.
The only one thing I want to add, which is short, is, and this happens in things that Peter gets involved in, is that the effects of synergy are unpredictable. If you're really allowing them to happen, they are unpredicted by the sum of the parts. Something else happens. When Peter put together, a Nobel Prize winner with Kiyoshi Kiramiya, with any number of Medard Gable, and then CJ in the audience, there's an unpredictable chain reaction that starts to happen. And that's what you have to be open with Synergy. Synergy is not necessarily a manageable business technique. It's like being open to what happens and being surprised by what happens. And that's why the quality techniques are sometimes hard to manage or accept, because it doesn't run according to anybody's predictions. It leads to something better than anyone expected could happen, or possibly worse if there's a wrong sort of combination or element that happens. But so that's the only thing I would add, that it's unpredictable.
Peter.
Sure. Let's speak to what even occurred in that event. This was in 1995, Bucky's centennial birthday that we hosted at the UCSD Mandeville Center. About 400 people in the audience, and we did have a great panel of people there. Harry Croto, Allegra Snyder was there, and a former governor of Alaska who had hosted Bucky when he was the Northern Forum chairman, Governor Hickel. So it was a great panel, and I was, I don't wear a tie very often, but I thought that this was something that had to be relatively formal, and I was I guess the moderator for that. And Doug and others were up in the booth. They were managing sound and lights. And Shrikant, I mentioned this, up comes this guy with long hair and a briefcase, and he reaches into his satchel and he takes these pink brochures out and he throws them in the audience, and he says, "Everybody, we're not doing it fast enough. We need to move faster." And here was CJ. So this is actually my first real introduction to CJ and his passion for Bucky and his work. And I was a little bit scared because I didn't, this was not planned. And later on, Doug said, "Well, that was the best theater that we had all night, was this guy, unpredictable, certainly wasn't in my program, coming up and really shocking everybody awake, if you will. You have a panel and everybody kind of talks nicely and tells their story. Here was a guy that was basically saying, 'Wake up.' And it was great theater and totally unpredictable."
Yeah, and I tried to tell Peter that something unpredictable would probably happen. And then when it happened, Peter accused me of setting it up. And I said, no, I had nothing to do with it. I just, and CJ threw these pink flyers straight up into the air, and they fell around him like a pink mushroom cloud. It was unbelievably theatrical. If it had been rehearsed, it never would have worked. But he just went up there and did it.
Well, that's wonderful. Doug, on building on that, I want to tell you the thing that he did, CJ did, when we started brainstorming about how do we do this Bucky-inspired comprehensivity meetups. And what he came up with was this, okay? Now, I'm, of course, this is my own way of thinking about it. This is octahedron, of course. And he says that there are 4 on-ramps. So imagine like the synergy is at the center here, okay? There are 4 on-ramps here. There are people who are focused on design of physical systems, design of systems. That's the green part. There are people who are focused on geometry, which is mostly kind of thinking and really working through the mathematics of it. There are people who are focused on what he calls integrities. This is the purple part, I would say. So this is, this is the holistic kind of thinking of saying, what does synergy really mean? And then there is a part of collaboration, of actual kind of this unifying force where you're actually open to the conversation. And what he says is that, what he said was that different people are strong at different things. So if we create a program where all of these people are welcome and are talking to each other, then you have all aspects. These are aspects, these are human aspects. This is our ability to act. This is our ability to think and integrate what is going on. This is our ability to have deep intuitions about what is truth. And this is our ability to love and to work, have this, kind of open heart to each other so that we can learn from each other. So this emotion, action, thought, and intuition. And if you create a space where all of these and all combinations of these are welcome, it is more synergetic than if it is just focused on this or this or this, because they build on each other. They add dimensionality to everything that everybody does. And we have ability to learn from each other. So this is this is what CJ came up with. So he doesn't just throw these pink flyers all around him, creating a cloud, which is an amazing thing. But what he's able to throw out, he was able to throw out, are these integrations that bring so many things together. So that's what I wanted to say. Peter, go ahead.
Doug mentioned this, as you did too, Shrikant, that a Zoom meeting is just inherently synergistic. If we had a Zoom meeting and one person showed up, there is no meeting. It's you talking to yourself. There is no synergy in you talking to yourself. So a good Zoom meeting at a minimum has to have two. This has, I don't know, 15 or 20. So the opportunity to connect, to learn something new is exponentially expanded. Probably if you get too many people, it just gets to be chaotic. But that's the opportunity within this particular forum that we're having right here. And gosh, in the last 3 years, I participated in, I'm sure, hundreds of Zoom meetings. I have stacks of notes that I would never have been able to take from experts from around the world. I just sort of am shocked as I started to go through and organize them, how much I was able to learn sitting here at this desk when we were all stuck at home and couldn't go meet, but we were able to meet this way. I like the quote, and maybe this relates to what Jeff was asking a little earlier. Bucky said this statement, and I really struggled with it initially, that unity is plural and at minimum two. So unity, I said, well, unity is one. That's a single thing. But Bucky said unity is plural and at minimum two, because you can't have something without something else to define it. He would say something to the effect, if I, when there was a circle and I would stand in the circle, I immediately wanted to jump outside the circle to know the distinction between the inside and the outsideness of that inside and the outside of the circle. Same thing being the inside of the tetrahedron and the outside of the tetrahedron. And Jeff, if I go back to your question about oxygen, oxygen is an element, one element on the periodic chart that gives us life. I think the atmosphere is something like 80% nitrogen, 18 or 19% oxygen, and the other trace elements. It is by itself a single element in the O2 in the atmosphere, but when we breathe it in, it combines with our bloodstream. It allows us to oxygenate our blood, and what we expel is no longer oxygen. We expel CO2, a carbon molecule attached to that oxygen that now is a new part of the atmosphere that we expel every single breath that we take. So we're all doing this now. And if you will, the reverse is going on in the plant kingdom. Thank God, because they're the ones that expel oxygen and take that carbon and put it into their plants and grow the things that, whether the trees or the things that we eat. So I don't know if that's an answer that's what you were looking for, Jeff, but it's there are a lot of individual elements on the periodic table that have their function in combination with other things, that they work as molecules together, not just by themselves most of the time.
Thank you, Peter. We'll do the full Q&A very soon. But Doug, would you like to add anything, and then we will go to the Q&A. Go ahead.
To what specifically? To the question about...
no, you unmuted, so I thought if you wanted.
Oh, no, I didn't.
Okay.
That wasn't intentional.
Okay, wonderful. All right. So folks, now is time for questions. Now I have some questions here, so I'm going to list some of them. And then if you want to add at this point, just questions. Okay. So the format is we're going to take all the questions, and then I'm going to give a chance to everybody to answer them. Okay, that's the format. So the questions I already have is the question of predictability. How important is, where does predictability fit in? The second one was on dimensionality, that the point that Pohl brought up. Ella brought up the question of life cycle. How does synergetics integrate with a life cycle? Then there was Jeff's question about what is the role of the individual element, and what is the role of the context, and how do you handle complex systems which are dynamic? Then there was the issue of how do you make synergy last? How do you make sure that there are no kind of negative effects of synergy? And how do you keep focused on the whole? These are some of the things that I heard people ask, but I'm not sure whether I got everything. So try to formulate your question in a crisp way. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to add a question. And I'm going to start with the more general questions first. Ella, what's your question? Ella, you need to unmute.
Yes, I am curious if an element of opposition might be important to create synergy.
Wonderful.
Because it seems to take it to a higher level, a deeper level, and to be an essential component to me in creating synergy. You often see this, for example.
Let's not do answers. Let's not do answers. It's the question. What is the role of opposing elements in synergy? Okay, perfect. Doug, what's your question?
I have a question for Peter. I've known Peter now for 27 years. And he's been working on the global energy network and the grid, and the idea of the grid. That's reading Critical Path inspired him to work on that. And I'm curious, in these 2.5 decades that have passed, if you're thinking about the energy grid has changed at all. Has the technology moved beyond that sense of wire? Are we moving more to wireless? Are we moving, I don't know, does that sort of infrastructure project, does it still make sense? And what is your thinking after working on that for as many decades as you have?
Wonderful. We will take that towards the end, because I want to do the general questions about the nature of synergy itself first. Okay, so if there are no more questions, let me go ahead. Let me look at these questions. So let's take the complex of questions that Jeff asked. What is the role of context in synergy? The background, there is the foreground, there is the, there is the figure, and there is the ground. What is the role of ground in synergy? And what is the role of individual? What's the role of connectedness? Let me see if Paul had a question. Paul, do you have a question?
No, now that I missed my little window there, so I'll just, because my question relates to Jeff's. Am I supposed to now try to answer Jeff's?
No. Let me first put I'll give you the first chance to answer the question.
Okay, but I'll do my question then, if you don't mind.
Please
I
do.
just have one
Go
more
ahead.
question,
Go ahead.
which is it fair to consider a synergy between a writer, what he writes, and a listener? That's my question.
Wonderful. Writer, listener, synergy. These are so amazing questions. Okay, so let's take the question of context. Let's keep the complex part aside. Let's look at the context. So there are three parts. What is the role of individual things? What is the role of context? And what is the role of connection between things? So if anybody wants to answer that, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Paul, I'm going to give you the chance to answer it first. So the question is, what is the role of individual things, connections between the individual things, and the context in this concept of synergy? Paul.
So my question mark was to add a question, which I did, and I'm not ready to answer Jeff's brilliant question.
Sure.
I'm passing.
That's
Thank
fine.
you.
That's fine. Anybody who wants to answer the question, go ahead and type an exclamation mark. You don't need to have a definitive answer, but if you want to even talk towards an answer. So first one, I think, is the context. What is the context? Because everything happens in a context, and context is much larger than the players within it. And most people are usually just focused on the players within it. And you can't really understand that. So let's start with Kurt. Kurt, go ahead.
If we look at the biology, which is what Bucky was looking at, right? He was looking at the geometry of nature. So I guess, well, natural systems, I guess we should call it. Context is everything, right? You can't have a phenomena at one level of scale and say, I'm just going to translate it to another level of scale, right? You can't take a solution in one environment in a place in the earth and just transplant it somewhere else and have it work the same way. So context is everything. And then, as he pointed out, obviously, temperature is a big part of that, right? If the temperature is too high, those atoms are not going to associate. And he was talking about hydrogen and oxygen and forming water. Well, what happens to the parts? Well, they get bonded, right? They're bonded together pretty firmly, right? You have to put a lot of energy in to boil it. And so that bonding, they turn from a single thing into something else. And I guess that's something that also comes out of this, the approach of looking at things as emergent, which is that when the parts come together in a system, it changes them and it changes their interaction. So it's not just that this system level stuff happens, the synergy happens at one level, but by becoming a system, then all the parts are changed. You think about people in a political movement, right? It's not just that high level political movement and what it did. Those people got changed, they got agency, and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I agree. Context is everything.
Wonderful. Beautifully put. Thank you. Next up is Peter. Peter, go ahead.
I did some training a long time ago that talked about context and content and spent a lot of time really trying to understand this. And they used the fruit bowl theory of life, that your context was the bowl, is how you hold things, and the content was the orange and the banana and the apple that you put into that make a fruit salad. So there's the synergy, if you will, of the fruit salad. And so for me personally, and this is just for me, my context was, and some of it clearly came out of the study that I did, was, why am I here? Why am I personally as a human being here on this planet? What am I here to do? And the answer for me came up with I'm here to make a difference. I'm here to contribute. I'm here to do more than just be a food gatherer. I wanted to do something that would make a contribution beyond me individually. So that was my context, and within that, I have done a number of things that I would put in that fruit bowl. That some were involved with a world hunger activity that started here in San Diego and went national. Another one was Bucky's. When I read Critical Path, I went, oh my God, if this is the #1 strategy for the world, that's pretty damn important. Is anybody doing anything? I had an engineering degree, and since they weren't, I said, okay, I'll take it on. So that was me taking the stand, and other people showing up around that. And then Doug mentioned the Sim Center, which we can take on another session. But those were activities within that context that clearly had many synergies with relationships and things that were written, the written word that then would be published either online or in magazines that reached millions of people that I will never ever know or interact with, but had an impact because of the written word, because of something that went out on a website. So that's for me an example of going from the fruit bowl theory of a context to what I decided to do within that for my life and the work that then resulted in just so many relationships and opportunities that I actually had no idea when I started what was going to transgress. I just knew that if I moved in this direction and kept moving, things happen.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Next up is Doug, followed by Jeff. Doug.
I like what both Kurt and Peter said, about the context. I want to extend the image of what Peter said. The bowl, when it's upright, holds things. And there's a demonstration in the play of a stainless steel bowl where you turn it upside down. You drop marbles in a bowl, they collect and they swirl around inside the bowl. You drop them on the outside of the ball, and this is Bucky's demonstration of concave and convex. They bounce off to all corners of the room unpredictably. And we'd have to have ushers come in and get the marbles so an audience member didn't trip on the marble that had bounced off stage. So the diffusion of a synergy or the collection of a synergy, I think the system by nature, and tetrahedron is the smallest system that has an inside and an outside, and that which separates inside from outside. And I know an anthropologist who teaches in Tijuana, and her specialty is borders and migration from like Central America to Mexico to the United States. And we've had a number of talks about how all healthy borders are permeable. They're not hard. You don't build a wall. That kind of represents death. These borders between things, if they don't breathe, then they die. And so that context of, is the synergy happening inside the system or outside? And in running a theater, this was important. I mean, audience or artists who wanted to come and work at the theater or go to the theater, do they hit walls that keep them from getting inside the theater? There are various ways audiences get discouraged from entering the theater, and people are not even aware of it.
Wonderful.
We had to teach some of our white ushers in San Diego not to flinch when Black people came to the door. That's something that makes them bounce off the doors of the theater. And so we would send a Black woman on staff out to be like a greeter that they have in the Black churches and say, yeah, you're in the right place, come in, welcome. So do you have doors that are hospitable, or do you have doors that keep people out? And then the synergies can't move from inside to outside unless there's some system, which we've been talking about this in terms of people bombing Zoom meetings. How do you keep those people out and the people who want a healthy interaction in?
Wonderful. Let's go with Becky, followed by Jeff, and then we'll go to the next question. Becky.
So the issue of context, I think Bucky was very, I guess he emphasized the importance of defining where to draw the line. And so having to define what was the whole system meant everything that was within it was influential, relevant. Everything that was outside did not take away because it was excess. And so what was the issue with it if we did not start big enough to include everything? I'm going to quote him. We may not, we are unlikely to know what is critical variables outside the system, which will continue to plague us. Interactions of the unknown variable inside and outside the arbitrarily chosen limits of the system are probably going to generate misleading or outrightly wrong answers. If we are to be effective, we are going to have to think in both the biggest and most minutely incisive ways permitted by intelligence and by the information thus far won through experience. So we don't want to miss something, because when we don't know what the context is, the content that we're working with may lead to conclusions that don't make sense. So.
Wonderful. Thank you, Becky. Let's go with Joe and Jeff, because I'm keeping Jeff at the end because that was his question, and then we will go ahead and go to the next question. Joe.
So I'm kind of, I'm just thinking about some of the things that I learned about Bucky in the past, and one of the things is, understanding where the boundaries are, and making sure you understand where the boundaries, and then understanding what's relevant within the boundaries. So he has circles of relevancy, so that, and he calls it essentially tuning in into the problem. So there are things that are, I'm going to maybe get this wrong. It's like lucidly relevant, almost relevant, and it's almost relevant, and I think it's and he has basically a whole process about how to determine, if something is too frequent and not relevant, and basically a way of tuning in and looking in, and just basically he has an approach about how to tune in to a specific problem to understand the context and understand the boundaries, and then when to push beyond the boundaries. So I didn't explain that very clearly, but it does give context. If you're talking about context, tuning in, I think his ideas about tuning in are actually pretty clear.
Wonderful. So Jeff, what do you think about the role of context, individuals, and connections between them?
Well, thank you, Shrikant. I appreciate all of you being willing to consider even those three things together, because I think there's something about the human condition where we want to look for answers that are simpler than are actually true. And one of my favorite quotes is Einstein's quote: "Everything should be made as simple as it possibly can be, but not one bit simpler than it actually is." And I think that for example, you could start everything from the vantage point of an individual and then build from there. And it's hard to argue with, let's just talk about human beings for a moment, that every single human being exists, to some extent as an individual. It's a good thing and it's a problem, or you could imagine that there's no such thing as an individual. There are just related entities here, and that's all there is. And from the very beginning, we absorb everything into our understanding and language and abilities and worldviews and everything from other people, and we are ultimately completely unavoidably connected forever and ever. Or you could step off the earth and look at it from space and say, okay, well, there's what it looks like, which is always an interesting experience because it certainly looks different from a distance than it does, looking down the street. And so this idea of that maybe it's true, I'll just pose for a second here.
Sure, go ahead.
Maybe it's true that we are individuals.
So that we can go to other questions.
Okay, so maybe it's true that we are individuals. Maybe it's true that we're not. And maybe it's true that context, as in we're living on this planet together, that defines everything. Maybe all these things, seemingly contradictory or in competition with each other, are true. And I argue a lot for the willingness to consider a variety of things as being true, rather than having to settle on one.
Thank you, Jeff. So what I want to say is that Bucky is always looking at the integration. He's always looking at the whole. So whenever he's looking at anything, he's looking at the context of it. And he's saying, what is the right way of looking at the context? He's always looking at the individual. He's never forgetting connections of the individual with other things. He's never forgetting the context. So it's a very profound way of approaching that is what is called systems thinking. And it's a profound way of integrating individual elements, the connections between them, and the context. So I invite people to explore that further. Peter, would you like to make any comment? And we'll go ahead and go to the next question.
Just and I'll maybe pose this to Doug because he wrote the word so potently. I remember the question near the end of the play. Bucky would say, well, "Why are we here?" And I was actually confused when I first heard it. It's like, why am I here tonight to be in this play, or why am I here on the planet? And Doug, if I recall, it's like we're here for each other. We're here to be, partners in this activity together. We're here for each other because no one of us individually could survive without each other in some way, whether it be the system to deliver us water or food, or even if you go live in the bush all by yourself. You're here on the good graces of somebody that figured out how to make sure you can get the necessities of life. So for me, that was part of the context of the play. Is why are we here? Is to that we're here for each other. Is that right, Doug?
Well, there are two answers to that. One of them is, why are we here near the end? We're here to solve problems. But earlier in the play, when he isolates himself, like the Buddha going to the mountaintop, he eventually comes back, turns to the audience and goes, we're here for each other. So the more he isolates himself into his own understanding, he realizes, oh, I'm here for everybody else. So it's a move away from the crowd and then a move back to the crowd, much like the Buddha goes to the mountaintop and then returns to the marketplace. It's a breathing. And we create either or choices. It's the individual, it's the group. Whereas Bucky says, if the individual most serves his own creative purposes, he will serve the group. It will be a side effect. It will be a 90-degree angle precessional effect. If you authentically move in what you're supposed to do, he doesn't mean the invisible hand of God interpreted as greed, but he means, Adam Smith actually probably meant empathy when he said that. And so the Bostonian viewpoint of all that individualism is the sense that they're still part of a group.
Yeah, I just want to say that, Bucky's greatness is that he's a thinker who thinks in terms of integration. Most modern approaches of most modern ways of approaching problem is disintegrated. And it's just kind of, it's like, going to town of saying, okay, I can divide this into these multiple things, and it can be this one, and it can be, what he's trying to do is that he's kind of stepping back and taking a view of the whole and seeing how the whole operates. It is profoundly different from most modern traditions. And you really have to change it is like a Copernican revolution. And that's what you have to get in order to get what Bucky is saying about synergy. And it is a dramatically different. So it is a dramatic change. Go ahead, Doug.
I just had one thing to add that sort of leads to one of the other questions, but and it wasn't until I'd worked on the play for 5 years writing it and then 15 years being produced all over the place that I began to perform the role myself. And I don't think I fully understood this till I performed the role when I realized that Bucky is one of the great theorists of democracy and what that means, what the individual initiative means. And it's very hard to express, but it's sort of like in an emergency, like the crew of a ship when the ship's in danger. They just leap to do the right thing. They don't have a meeting and talk about it like the armies do or strategize it like other. But the Navy was very comprehensive and they were trained to sort of solve problems as a team. Because if the captain got swept overboard, somebody had to step into that knowledge and that power. And so that idea that anyone is capable of leading at any point in time. And I've actually gotten to know some of the people in the local service workers unions in LA that are changing the face of LA politics. And they train the same way. One guy gets arrested and somebody else can lead the initiative to, increase pay. And that union here in LA is one of the reasons we have a nationwide increase in the minimum wage. It's the union here in LA and individuals who said this is important and taught other individuals how to step in if they got arrested or if they faltered or if they disappeared. Very similar to Bucky's idea of.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Folks, sorry for extending this discussion very long on this question, but it was a great question. Now let's take a pair of questions together. One was by Judy and one was by Ella. So one part is, what is the role of opposition in synergy? And the second one was kind of implicitly in the same area of saying, how do you make synergy last? How do you make sure that it doesn't create opposition that is going to destroy it? So any thoughts about the role of opposition and synergy? Ella, as it is your question, will go a little bit later. I'll have you go a little bit later. Let me see if anybody else wants to talk about opposition and synergy. Okay, let's go with Ella. Ella, go ahead.
Sure. I was just going to say, the idea of combining H2O, to create water, which of course is a needed substance, is great. It has the emergent feel to it. But it seems to me that without some sort of oppositional force, first of all, I think it's built into nature. And I think to ignore it is, I want to approach reality and the way nature is constructed. And destruction is a part of the universe. So I think that with synergy arising out of, let's say, an interaction with people or an actor in an audience or a composer of a great piece of music and its wonderful effect on the audience. I think that something is arising there, but it's arising because perhaps the composer has incorporated a lot of drama, or the actors have incorporated negative aspects as well, because you need to build that tension. And I just think in the workplace, for instance, it's going to occur because we're human beings. We have our biological needs, there's competition. This is just reality. And the more we think about the reality in terms of how it's going to build synergy and perhaps even diminish synergy, I think we get a clearer picture of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Let's go. Anybody else wants to answer the question? Go ahead and type exclamation mark. What is the role of opposition in synergy? Paul next. Paul, go ahead.
Quick example, magnetic force, north and south pole, two magnets. When you put them, those are opposites, they're opposing forces. When you put them together, you create a new force because there's movement. There's a repelling movement. It's just a quick physical world example. That's all I have.
Excellent. Actually, so let's see. So I love the example of, I like, again, I'm just beginning to study Bucky. So he has this idea of tensegrity. So there is a tension between elements that hold things together. So take even this thing that we talked about, right? That there is emotion, there is thinking. There is a tension between emotion and thinking. There is intuition of saying, okay, what is really going on? And the practical action, there is a tension between them. But you can actually use the tension to produce something which is amazing. I mean, one example of that would be a plot line. You need to create a conflict and then resolve the conflict for there to be an engaging story. You see, in the beginning, it seems to be different because they operate differently. But there is a way of taking a perspective that integrates those to see them as elements, necessary elements to support the system as a whole. So there is that opposition. Like, for example, if it was all of one kind, it wouldn't produce quite the same effects. Like, so that's how I think about the issue of opposition, because another way of thinking about it is that really, my favorite way of thinking about it is using a tetrahedron, right? Tetrahedron has these 4 faces, and they are different from each other. They have different functions, but they work together, and together they close the system. It's the minimum system. They are different, but they're part of the system. There is a tension between each of them, but they form the system. So that's how I think about it. Let's see. Let's take the question of writer and listener, and then we will take the final question about how the energy grid has changed. So we'll end with Peter answering that question. So what is going on between a writer and a reader, a speaker and a listener? What kind of synergy exists between? How does synergy work when you're speaking? I'm saying something and you're listening to it. There are a whole bunch of people who have said something and are listening to it. How does synergy work in this context? How does it work in the written form? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to say something. Anybody? All right, no takers for the question. Okay, let's go with the next one.
I will,
okay.
If no one else will, I'll address it briefly.
We'll go with Doug, followed by Joe. Doug, go ahead. Doug, you have muted yourself.
Yeah, writers do 2 things. One, to please themselves and their sense of integrity. And the other is then they find out what the audience does with it in a theater or publication or critics or whatever. But there's also a sense that there are certain kinds of works, like a Warner Brothers cartoon. And there will be jokes that the grandparents will laugh at, the parents will laugh at, the children will laugh at it, the grandkids will laugh at it. It's a piece that's aimed at many different audiences. It's a very simple cartoon, right? But it's not at all. It's a machinery, and I'll probably talk about the geometry of this in the session I'll do on February 19th, the geometry of theater and how it moved from the solo performer to the Greek drama, and how and the geometry of how that happened. And it's a natural kind of geometry, and it's the way humans behave. And a crowd gathers when somebody does something interesting. And so, you know, sometimes when a writer tries to please the crowd, they fail to do it. When they really write about what they know and where they grew up, suddenly Irish literature is popular around the world. Black literature is popular around the world. Sometimes when you go into what you know, it becomes more popular than you think, where you try to write to the world and you don't do it. The only other thing I'll mention in terms of the synergy of writer and audience, the only book Bucky wrote that never went out of print was Critical Path. And Kiyoshi Kuramiya worked on Critical Path, and he'd worked a lot with AIDS and drugs and interactions. And he called himself not a co-writer or ghostwriter, he called himself an adjuvant, which is a drug that makes other drugs work more effectively. So he was able to take Bucky, and by the way he interacted with Bucky, make it permanently publishable, and it's the only book that never went out of print. And I think it's the weird synergy between Kiyoshi, who was an amazing man in his own right, and Bucky, so who suddenly it went to a much broader audience and never went away. It never stopped being published, and it changes lives like it did mine and Peter's. And you know, it's a really interesting mechanism.
Wonderful, thank you. So it will be Joe, followed by me, followed by Paul. Paul, I'll keep at the end because that was his question. Joe, go ahead.
I mean, I just think really quickly about the idea of unity as plural minimum too. In other words, if you have a speaker and a listener, that they're complementary with one another. They're fundamentally different, but yes, but they complement one another. So I mean, that's essentially where I think about, even, you know, when I'm thinking about whether it's a writer and an audience or a speaker and a listener. So that's one of the principles that come to mind.
Thank you, Joe. Now we have done, so I want to first talk about speaker and listener, and then I want to talk about writer and reader, because you can see this principle very clearly in speaker and listener. Actually, what you're engaging in is a conversation. That's where synergy is coming in. If you're speaking from the podium and just speaking out towards the other people and never listening to them, there isn't much synergy going on. Synergy happens through cycles. It's the feedback loops between systems that are compatible with each other, that keep producing this virtuous cycles, feedback cycles that produces. So for example, when you're speaking to someone, if you're speaking, looking at them, speaking to them, not just speaking your ideas, but speaking your ideas, putting it into their context, and then actually listening to what they say in response, taking that in and speaking again, them listening to it and speaking back. Now that is synergy. I mean, that's what is happening here. Synergy is all about these cycles, and faster the cycles, the quicker you are to relinquish anything that you think is false, that you see is false immediately, and changing. That frees up your mind to say the next thing. Similarly, if other person is doing that, you quickly ramp up. You're getting the entire advantage of all the rich thinking and experience of that other person, and you are using that. It's like a mirror, with the light bouncing back and forth, becoming brighter and brighter, because anything that is dark is being thrown away by both parties. That is synergy. Now, how does this work in writing? Most of the times it does not. Too many writers think of writing as one to many, and it's like broadcasting model. But that's not actually that's not necessarily how it was done. For example, in the scribal age before printing, books were very hard to come by. So whether in the peripatetic school of Aristotle, or University of Paris of Aquinas, or the Gurukuls of India, or Lao Tzu and his students, the way they interacted with the written material was through this envelope of conversation about it. Waterong puts it very beautifully, that all text is pretext, and I would add to it, all text is pretext when it ignores the context. So you're just focused on the text, you're just focusing on going one direction. You have to go the other direction. One of my favorite examples of that is Nassim Taleb, writing his book Anti-Fragility. He wrote it and published it chapter by chapter on his website. And he got thousands of comments, and he took them and modified the book based on that as he wrote the book. See, that loop is synergistic loop. But what it means is that you are committed to truth. You're actually opening up your arms and inviting everybody in, actually listening to them, and doing that relentlessly, day after day, year after year, decade after decade, but also day after day, hour by hour, minute by minute. And that is what produces synergy in speaking or writing. Paul, you're next.
I'll do a very, very quick example. Jeff, can you see the chat? Can you see it, Jeff? I need somebody.
Yes, I can.
Okay. I'm gonna write one sentence. Very quickly. Okay. Now, I propose from the sentence I just wrote in chat, there's maybe 23 people in this conversation. We created 23 synergies, and it's all about Jeff's context, because there's two elements, but each of the elements I'm combining with has their own context, and something that was not latent in either of us exactly is created when they read the sentence. And then they respond in Shrikant's manner of conversation, and all these threads made me put this together. Thank you. There's my
Wonderful.
thought.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And that's what we do when we do, for example, collaborative poetry. On Mondays, we do collaborative poetry. And the magic of that is exactly that each person puts the best line they possibly can about the subject. And then the second person adds to that. And the third person adds to that. And once everybody is done doing that, everybody's saying, how can we make this better? How can we make this better? And everybody forgets what line they have. They don't say that, oh, this is my line, nobody will change it. No, they are looking at the poem as a whole, and they're trying to say, what will make it better? And people actually do that, okay? So that's a great example of writing and reading and synergy, which Paul is, amazingly good at. He's a regular. on these Mondays. So Pohl, that's again a great example. All
Can I
right.
say one more thing very quickly, that I just want to stress that everyone saw a different sentence then. That's the context. Everyone read a different sentence in just a minute ago when I typed that. So thanks, Srikant.
Thank you. Thank you. Next, we're going to end with the question that Doug asked. Doug, can you do me a favor and ask the question again of Peter about the energy grid?
Well, he's been working on the energy grid since he read Critical Path. And I'm just curious, in these 2.5 to 3 decades that he's been working on it, he'd been working on it for years when I met him, what his thinking on the energy grid is now. And as technology, is it moving towards that, or is it moving to something more ephemeral but more integrative around the world? And that's a slightly different question, but what is his thinking on the energy grid? He's worked on it a long time.
Yeah. So I'm gonna throw up an image real quickly. I'm gonna try to do this in just a couple minutes. It's an in-depth dialogue for sure. But let me put this one image up. Hopefully you can y'all see the Earth at night from NASA.
Yes.
Okay, great. So we're all familiar with this. It's the beautiful mosaic that NASA has done of nighttime images of the world. If you put all the nighttime maps together, this is what we look like. And people will go, gosh, that's where people live. And that's where the rich people live. I want to be clear about that. That's where people who live who have lights. There's still 1 billion people in Africa live there with very little lighting. They use firewood. Women walk for firewood 4 or 5 miles a day to denude their environment so they can cook and stay warm. So this is a map of who we are, of where the people who are wealthy enough to have electricity live. And most of us were born in this culture, so we were fortunate. Underneath all of those lights is an electrical grid, a high voltage AC, a high voltage DC transmission grid that deliver the electricity from where it's generated to where you and I flip a switch, whether it be at our homes or our businesses. So the electrical infrastructure under that is a high voltage transmission line, usually above ground. Sometimes it's underground, that delivers that power. In history, it was from coal-fired power plants. It was from nuclear power plants, hydropower plants. What we've incorporated, and so this is maybe the answer to Doug's question a little bit more, is instead of an either or solution, now we have, an either or, we now have an and both. That we have expanded the ability of this system to include more options. Because in Southern California, where I live, the desert, which is just 60, 70 miles away, now has extensive wind farms and solar farms that are feeding into where I live in San Diego. They actually added a new transmission line to deliver that wind and solar power, so that now people in San Diego, just by the virtue of living here, are 1/3 renewable energy customers, still using the same exact transmission system that was there before, but now there's even an enhanced transmission system to make wind and solar more available. The distinction here is we used to build coal-fired power plants, nuclear power plants, relatively close to where we worked and lived, so we would shorten the distance of that transmission line. Now, I talked about Wyoming earlier. That's a long, long way away from where many people live, but people in Wyoming can access that enormous wind resource and sell that to people throughout the Western States Coordinating Council, the Western Grid, so that we can all benefit from the huge resource that's in those northern plains states. And if we go a little in a smaller focus, a finer distinction, now I have solar on my rooftop. Many of you maybe have that as well. So you can put solar panels up there, and I run my house almost entirely on solar, but I'm not disconnected from the grid, because during the day I generate more than I need, and so I sell it back to the utility during the day, and at night when I'm not generating any at all, the grid and the battery is that system that provides enough electricity for me to have lights on and again keep the refrigerator cold. So what we've done as we ephemeralize, another critical generalized principle is ephemeralization. As we've ephemeralized by doing more and more with less and less, as we've added options, we've made the grid more robust, more flexible, so that there are more options to be cleaner, but we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're enhancing the existing system and adding to it so that we can be cleaner as we go forward. So the long answer, Doug, but that's the best I can do in 2 minutes.
Thank you, Peter. Really appreciate that. And we will have, maybe later in the year, have, kind of do more on this. So thank you so much. I want to tell you about some amazing things that are coming up. Next week, Jon Brett and Yoshimi are going to be here, and they're going to be talking about the idea of TetraMeme. This is based on the tetrahedron. They've been working on this idea, tetramaps and tetramemes, for the past 20 years. They're from New Zealand, and they're going to be talking about this idea of TetraMeme, this kind of fourfold way being applied to mostly business organization. I'm also delighted to let you know that that Harold Nelson has agreed to do more presentations on his core idea of the design flight school. I thought his presentation was just incredible, and I talked to him today, and he has agreed to really do an in-depth presentation on his idea of this design flight school. So what I encourage you to participate in that, especially those of you who have read the Design Way and who participated in the Design Way meetups. Design Way was CJ's, one of his most favorite books. When I did an interview with him about his book, I was interviewing him about CJ's book, and CJ held up this orange book 4 times during his interview. I said, what is this? So that's how I got to really say, okay, I had to find out what this Design Way is. So, I'm going to announce it very soon. So look forward for you participating in that one. As you know, we've got just incredible number of meetups. Doug is going to be here, talking about I'm a Verb. Kurt is going to be here talking about comprehensivity of Bucky. So amazing meetups coming up. Don't miss a single one. And if you miss them, they're all there on YouTube. So you go to YouTube, look for 52 Living Ideas, and look for the Bucky inspired playlist. All right. And Peter, thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And I thought you did a fantastic job of getting this conversation started. With just a little bit, you produce all of this amazing conversations. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Take care, everybody. Good night.